Hello, Bill.
Good morning, Matt.
Welcome to the DMZ, everyone.
Are you still on your
I'm still
post-election high?
Yeah, I am. That's great. Times are good. Things are good. And Bill, I have to say, there is something that happens when political parties and movements lose, and that is that they tend to go crazy. And I feel like that started to happen on the left. It's been seeing examples of, things that are just, I guess the most egregious example, there was a piece, I think it was in Salon or Slate, but essentially they're the same publication. We might as well just, regardless. Someone who was basically making the case that, we don't really need to honor veterans anymore because they haven't really fought a real war for freedom in 70 years. So screw all the, giving them all the love on Veterans Day. That's just one example, a little slice of the radical left that I think has come out just in the past week. And, I think that this happens, when a side loses a battle and they're sort of stunned by that. There's confusion, there's frustration, and there's anger.
Well, I think the Salon piece is not a indicative piece of what's going on the left right now. I think Salon has a handful of provocative far left writers that are good for traffic. And obviously, you can find folks on all sides of the spectrum that say crazy things, but I don't think that is sort of a true window into the heart of the left right now. I think where there's a still room for plenty of debate whether it's accurate or not is I think that there's a sense on the left that Democrats weren't populist enough, they weren't Elizabeth Warren enough. They didn't, hit Republicans on being tied to Wall Street and the 1% enough. And there's really counter arguments to all that. The most obvious being, well, you just got wiped by Republicans, and you're saying they weren't left wing enough. How does that make any sense? And I think the debate can get more detail and nuance from there. But I don't think you're seeing this leap towards, okay, let's all be anti-military single-payer advocates and everything will be okay. I don't think that is the predominant theme on the left right now.
Well, whatever the case, things have gotten interesting, and I'm all for interesting. And we've also seen build some examples of, let's call it a political deathbed conversion. Yesterday, Mary Landrieu has suddenly decided that it's time to get this XL Keystone pipeline.
Well, that's not fair. She had a Keystone bill for months. I mean, she didn't just draft the bill.
For some reason, she's now really gotten aggressive on it, taken to the floor, and it does seem to be, whether she was, for it before, it does seem like, I don't know, something has inspired her to really get aggressive in terms of pushing it.
Well, I think that the shift there is not with her; it's with the rest of the Democratic caucus trying to save her. I mean, she got unanimous consent on the Senate floor Wednesday night to have a Keystone vote move. I think early next week, and I think the House might move before then.
And Cassidy, her opponent, I guess, is pushing the House version of the bill.
Right,
so.
And I think the one thing you can say that Landrieu has moved on, or at least didn't stand. I don't know if this came up previously or not, but when she made her move, Republicans said, okay, we're going to do a Keystone bill. It's going to have Bill Cassidy's name on it. And Bill Cassidy's her opponent in the Louisiana Senate runoff. And Landrieu said, that's fine. If the final bill that goes to Obama is the Bill Cassidy Keystone bill, fine. I don't care. And then she'll play the I don't care who gets the credit. I just lowly little me getting all these Democrats to vote for the Senate. Put Cassidy's name on it. I don't care. So that's the little dance that's going on right now. I
it is funny. It is funny though, because if it's this, we've been talking about this for years now, Bill, for years, and if it's so important, I just don't know why this didn't pass the Senate earlier. Why it's taken until now for this to happen. I don't think, I'm not one of the people who happens to think that this is as big of a deal as people make it out to be. But in Louisiana, it's an important thing. And they do have this U.S. Senator from Louisiana who clearly wants it. I'm just wondering why it's taken so long to get around to this.
Well, I think you have a lot of factors at play. I mean, you saw on Twitter that I had predicted Obama would approve this himself.
That's right.
By the end of the year.
You were on top of that one, absolutely.
I wasn't predicting this. I didn't think. I mean, my thinking was, and still made up being the case, that Obama that if you take Obama's words at face value, which I generally do, he just doesn't think Keystone is a big deal either way, which is a view that I share. On the to puncture the conservative argument, it's just not that many jobs. It's one infrastructure project. If you really care about infrastructure jobs, you can do a much bigger infrastructure bill that Obama has written called the American Jobs Act, and get a whole lot of jobs. This is like a few thousand, and very few of them are permanent. On the environmental side, the State Department review has already said this is not going to have a big impact on the climate one way or the other. Canada's going to tap the tar sands anyway. They've already made plans to extend a pipeline out to the Atlantic Ocean from the west part of the country if Keystone doesn't get built. So that aspect of, and even there's
you
even
could argue that it would be more likely an ecological problem, and if they don't do it.
Well, there are some folks that we don't want the oil going on the train lines. That's unsafe. And then there's environmentalists say, well, that's just a bogus argument to try to justify the pipeline. These things go back and forth. But the White House attitude, and I think the attitude of some environmentalists a bit more quietly is, the bigger game is getting a cap on carbon emissions globally. Within any carbon cap, there's going to be some fossil fuel production. There's no scenario in the next 75 years where we zero that out. It's got to be greatly reduced over time. But something's going to get burned. And so who cares if you have this one project if you have the overall cap? So my attitude was that eventually Obama would want to approve it, get the credit for personally approving it, to mitigate the arguments against the broader climate regs he has that the EPA is working on right now. And now you see with this deal with China, that is a stepping stone towards a global deal at the Paris conference that's happening at the end of 2015. He doesn't want Republicans being able to say, you're just out to kill jobs and destroy oil and coal. Obama would say, no, this is part of a balanced approach. And look, I'm approving oil pipelines. I'm approving drilling offshore. We can do that and do the broader climate deal. So that's why I thought Obama wanted to get the personal credit for it, and why he didn't do it earlier is, whether it's just simply he wanted to go through proper channels. There's issues with the path of the pipeline in some of these states. They're still being hashed out in local courts. So why get ahead of that if you don't have why alienate some of your base supporters prematurely if you don't have to? Maybe there was the Tom Steyer factor that they didn't want Tom Steyer to sit on his money in the midterms, and they wanted to wait till the midterms were over. Although even Steyer himself gave a hint that he wouldn't dump on Obama if he proved Keystone, that the climate regs were a bigger deal.
Well, I think that's the real answer.
Those are the competing factors going on, and why I think it's taken so long.
Well, I think follow the money, as they say. I think that's the real answer. But it's a shame because Obama. This is one of the many examples how I think. This is one of the many examples where I think he could have been more of a uniter and had a less sort of contentious presidency had he done something very, again, I'm with him in the sense that I don't think this is that big of a deal. It's one thing he could have done that would have helped Mary Landrieu, possibly saved her seat, in Louisiana, which I think is gone. But it also would have been one thing he could have worked together with Republicans on and had a bipartisan agreement that would have been popular with almost everybody except for a few radical environmentalists. And Bill, as I think we would agree, this actually could have furthered their cause in the long run, by giving on something like this, which isn't that significant. And frankly, I think, again, could be much more likely an ecological problem if they don't build the pipeline. And yet he fought it. He fought it, whether it's stubbornness, whether it's a matter of deferring to the money on the left. We hear so much about the Koch brothers. How about a little more about Steyer? Or whether it's, frankly, just a matter of him being, sort of reflexively with the left on these issues. But this is something where he could have done much earlier, and I think he would have been better off. I think the country would have been better off. And I think they might have, maybe had a better election this time around had he done things like this before the election.
Well, and in fact, he has, and this has been actually controversial for him. To the notion that I think that if Keystone was approved earlier, that would have definitely saved Mary Landrieu, is undercut by what happened in Alaska. Obama, and this was reported on the New York Times a year or so ago. Obama literally leaned on the EPA to overrule some of the decisions by the EPA underlings to expedite Arctic drilling in Alaska. And the only rationale for doing that would be to help Mark Begich save his seat in Alaska, to say, I'm a Democrat in Alaska, but I'm pounding my fist at the White House, and I'm making sure that they let us drill. We want to drill in Alaska. And Begich had several ads making that case. He's out there on his snowmobile in the tundra. We're drilling right here because I stood up to President Obama. Blah, 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 blah. And look, I think there's no way Begich was going to win without that. But it was necessary, but in the end proved not sufficient. There are other issues going on. It's still generally a right-leaning state. Begich barely got in the last time, and it wasn't enough to save him. So it's not like Obama is above doing that. He's fully aware of the tricky thicket of energy politics. But I do think, and I've written this in the past, I think that the Bill McKibben wing of the environmental movement made a strategic error in prioritizing Keystone and making that a symbolic matter, and they should have kept their fire on getting the broader climate regs through. Fortunately, I think the regs are going to get through anyway, because they don't necessarily need a big movement push. But their elevating Keystone, I think, made some of these issues trickier for Obama to deal with. But to say it would have been less contentious to take that on, I don't necessarily buy. There's plenty of contention no matter what you do in that situation. And it's not clear that it would have helped Mary Landrieu one way or the other.
Not clear. We don't know. I think it's pretty clear it would have helped her.
You can only run the game one way. You can't prove the counterfactual.
Yeah, we don't know if it would have been enough. So you've got that happening. Do you want to talk? I guess the natural segue. I do want to talk about Gruber, obviously, but I think maybe the natural segue is to talk about China right now.
Well, I do think the climate deal is a huge thing. I take the point that some have made that it doesn't bind either country. It's not a treaty. It's not setting targets that are that farther beyond what they're already planning to do. What they're planning to do is not nothing. It's still it's still bending the curve downward as far as carbon emissions are concerned. By itself, it doesn't save the planet, but the whole idea is to set the stage for a larger global agreement that could keep the rise in temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius. And there is a big conference happening, a UN conference in Paris in December 2015. That's what everyone's eyes are toward. And since everyone knows that Obama can't get a treaty through the Senate, couldn't when Democrats control it, certainly can't with Republicans controlling it. Takes a 2/3 vote. They're not aiming for a legally binding treaty. They're aiming for something along the lines of what the U.S. and China just did, a global agreement with targets with pledges. It's not a silver bullet solution, but it's kind of chipping away at the problem. And people have right to be concerned. Can they get the job done fast enough before you have a larger climate crisis? I can't make firm predictions on that, but I'm of the firm mind that something is better than nothing, and this is probably as far as you can expect the world to do, considering the constraints of our current politics. And the fact that Obama is doing this is full steam ahead on this. Obviously, I would think would play a big role in 2016. Now, granted, I thought it was going to play a bigger role in 2014. It didn't play zero role. I thought it was going to be a much more dominant role. And I forget if we talked about this in the past, but I think Republicans, it's obviously not that big of a strategic error because they won anyway. But I thought they wanted to make a bigger deal about the climate rules. They could have, but those rules got announced right when the Bo Bergdahl swap happened, and Republicans got all fevered up about that, and something which they really had no means to stop, and they took their eye off the ball of the climate rules and did not make them nationally toxic. So Obama was able to kind of nudge that along without it becoming too big of a deal. Now I think another stage of those rules happened in January. Maybe they'll become a bigger deal then. But so far, Obama's been pretty undeterred in staying on this path, despite the fact that obviously it's tricky politics in oil and coal states, and could well be an issue in certain swing states in 2016.
Well, I think the China thing could potentially be a big deal. I think the fact that it doesn't have teeth is hugely problematic. But But I will say this, okay, so you've got, in terms of opposition to this sort of thing, there are various layers, right? So you've got a certain percentage of people who just simply do not believe in anthropogenic climate change. They're probably lost to you. Then you've got people who believe, yes, humans certainly have impacted the climate, but anything that we would do to address that would be, would be very damaging to sort of blue-collar workers in American workforce, and B would be of minimal import. In other words, we might be able to, if we cost all of these jobs and took all of this economic hit, we might be able to, marginally change the temperature by some fraction of a degree over the course of a generation, which maybe, certainly wouldn't justify the economic problem. And then I guess C would be, it's like pissing in the ocean if China and other emerging nations who are industrializing and whatnot, if they aren't also involved. And so then it becomes also a matter of national, sort of foreign policy, national security, of unilateral disarmament. Are we going to unilaterally damage our economy for something that might have a minimal impact on the environment, while China and other countries continue to pollute, what have you, and so, in other words, there are a lot of problems. There are a lot of arguments that conservatives, aside from simply saying I don't believe in global warming, there are a lot of more nuanced arguments conservatives can launch against this, and many of them are undermined or at least addressed if China is held to some sort of similar standards. There have been conservative arguments. I'll just finish real quick. There have been conservative arguments that say we should have a carbon tax. It should be offset by getting rid of an income tax or of a corporate tax. And you could address China by having border adjustments that would, in effect, force a carbon tax on China. But whatever the case may be, I think that if China is off the table, it's much easier to sell some sort of a carbon tax in America.
Your point on border adjustments is interesting because Lindsey Graham and John Kerry proposed a border adjustment in their Senate proposal in 2009, and obviously Republicans didn't hop to follow Lindsey Graham's lead. But that's why I think I just wrote a piece at the Campaign for America's Future site, ourfuture.org, that climate change is the new gay marriage. 10 years ago, the Republican Party bet hard against gay marriage. They thought they had the political hot hand. They won a slew of state ballot initiatives, and then in less than 10 years, that rug just got totally pulled out from under them. Even the warning signs were there. They lost the youth vote big in 2004, where they had not. It was a tie vote in 2000 and 2002. So you knew the generation issue was at play. George Bush even recognized that being too hard on gays was not good with swing voters. He came up for civil unions in the late weeks of the 2004 campaign. But Republicans stuck with that. They even had a bunch of ballot initiatives in 2006 against gay marriage. They really were hard on it, and now they have lost the youth vote every election, presidential and midterm, including this past one since. So here you have, at some point, the argumentation starts to fall apart. So here you are, it's 2014. For years, Republicans have said, Obama is unilaterally disarming. We can't solve this problem without China and India. This is an economic disaster. It's a tick away from it's a hoax. They're trying to move away from that extreme position, which is promising. But then Obama meets that standard and has a deal with China. And now the complaint is, oh, well, it doesn't have enough teeth. It's not binding. Well, the reason why it's not binding is because you guys won't vote for it. If you guys said,
but you can't have a deal if we're going to try our best. I mean, that it's not.
Well, the answer to that is
a deal.
Tell the world, we Republicans would love to pass a climate change treaty with teeth that involved all the developing nations. And so that gives Obama a free hand to negotiate such a pact when he goes to Paris 2015. If that's what you really want, you can do things to attain that. Obama's not the obstacle there. And so once you see a guy trying to cut the international deals, and on our side just making a lot of excuses that don't add up intellectually, I think you run the risk of being on the wrong side of history there and saying it's exposing the fact that you don't really want to solve this problem. You control Congress now, people. If you really want to solve climate change, if you really want to have a legislation with teeth, you are in a position to do something about it. And if you're just going to complain when someone else does something about it, that's going to speak more badly of you.
Well, I guess the one thing I would say is it's hard to predict the future, but I disagree with the notion that global warming, climate change, whatever you want to call it, is going to be the new gay marriage. Because even though I agree that that the trend, certainly among millennials, would be in that direction, I'm very skeptical that there will ever be the intensity on the issue. I mean, gay people are people that you can look at and be friends with and get to know on will and grace if you don't know any gay people, and there is an emotional component. It's always been a hot button social issue. And I think the environment, we've seen that the intensity is just not there. People just rank it very low in terms of their priority. So while I agree with you that there's a potential for it to cut against conservatives, I disagree that it has the sort of the potential to transform the culture to the degree that the gay marriage debate has.
Well, it's a more complicated debate than your gay marriage. Gay marriage is kind of cut and dry. You're with it or you're not. You think gays are equal rights or you don't. There's no policy nuance to it, really. Anything involving climate change, this is probably the most complicated policy matter ever. Right. It just gets involved into so many different nooks and crannies. Any proposal one has involves some aspect of winners and losers. And so it's very easy to pick apart anything that's concrete. And Republicans are on their strongest ground when they have a specific proposal in front of them, and they can say, this is going to raise your energy cost by X amount. It's going to kill this many jobs. To the extent that they can actually make a solid case on those matters, that's where they would be strongest. Where, to the extent where it is more likely to play out like a gay marriage thing, is if you get out of the policy specifics and it comes down to a question of values. Do you accept the science or not? If you can't clear that hurdle with me, I think there's something wrong with you as a person, as a politician, as a public figure. And to the extent that you're making excuses, you've seen a move away from this is a hoax to, well, I'm not a scientist, and now these various excuses. Well, this is not going to be strong enough to actually solve the problem.
No, but these are not insignificant. You call them excuses. I mean, I think even if you believe that it's man-made global warming, I think it's entirely, possible to believe that unless you get a strong commitment from, say, China and India, nothing we do will really matter except for harming our economy. And I think it's also not irrational to say, what's the cost? Is there a cost-benefit analysis? I mean, if we do some sort of irreparable damage to our economy and to our citizens, and it results in a fraction of a percent of a temperature change over 100 years or something, is it worth it? So, I mean, I think those are legitimate questions to ask.
Well,
Bill, let me just say, I'm not a scientist. Let me just say, Bill, I'm not a scientist. But having said that,
but you could ask those questions in good faith. That you could ask them to throw a lot of smoke. I think if the Republicans could certainly prove they actually care about solving the issue while raising those questions, if they accept good answers to those questions. I don't see any evidence that they're prepared to do that. But look, if they want to come out tomorrow with a carbon tax swap for massive income tax cut, they would probably get it. I mean, obviously the details have to be worked out, but that's something that I think Democrats would be very open to. And it'd probably be a lot easier to institute, a global carbon tax regime than having this kind of mishmash of cap and trade stuff that they're having to slog through right now.
And there are people, and there are Republicans. I think former Congressman Inglis, I believe Art Laffer support that. I mean, there are notable conservatives and Republicans who see that as just a compromise, whether or not it would be a good deal to get rid of the income tax. Now, some people would argue, well, it's never going to happen. You're going to end up with a carbon tax and an income tax. That's the obvious sort of, I guess, poison pill argument that could always be made. But assuming that you actually believe that people are negotiating in good faith, there are some conservatives and Republicans who are advocating that.
Now, you want to talk about Jonathan Gruber?
Yes. Hans Gruber or John Gruden, whoever he reminds you of. This is a fascinating thing, and I think it's probably been the biggest political story of the week, which is that this I guess he's an MIT professor, one of the architects of Romneycare and Obamacare, had on multiple occasions been very frank at academic conferences about a variety of things, including the fact that Obamacare was written in such a way as to get favorable results from CBO reports, to be purposefully opaque, not transparent, because voters are stupid. That has been, I hate to call it a firestorm because the mainstream media, with the exception of Morning Joe, has mostly ignored the story, aside from the occasional attempts to dismiss it as like, oh, that boys will be boys. This is how politics works. I argue that actually the bigger Gruber gaffe is the fact that he argued that that Obamacare that it wasn't a typo, that Obamacare was intentionally set up by design to say that if you live in a state that did not create an exchange, that you would not be eligible for tax credits. That's very significant because it's at the heart of a Supreme Court decision that could have severe damage to Obamacare. And I believe the pro-Obamacare folks are arguing that it was just a typo, that the spirit of course they meant to cover everybody. And so whether you want to talk about the very embarrassing, superficial, I would say at this point superficial because the law has passed, gaffes, and when we say gaffe, I mean gaffe, like I guess in the Washington sense of accidentally saying something you really mean, or the Supreme Court argument. I don't know. I think it's, Chris Cillizza at the Washington Post does this thing every week, who had the worst week in Washington. And I think Hans Gruber, yippee-ki-yay. Well, yeah, Hans Gruber from Die Hard. Yippee-ki-yay. John Gruber, I think he's probably had the worst week in Washington.
Well, I agree with you that, the most recently unearthed comments where he's musing about why the individual mandate penalties were called a penalty and not a tax. That stuff doesn't have much. That might have had import in the last Supreme Court case where they were actually debating that issue.
When Obama went, I think it was on ABC's This Week, and swore up and down that it was not a tax.
Well, and here's the thing about that. I mean,
John Roberts.
Forgive me for going back. It really gets past me. I think the semantic issue, and this is why I disagree with Ron Fournier that Gruber's comments prove that was a lie. Because it's not a question of lie versus truth; it's a question of semantics. It is not a tax in the sense that everybody is going to pay higher taxes now because of this law. It is a tax in the sense that if you don't buy health insurance, the penalty that is assessed upon you is administered through the IRS in the form of a tax. That's just two different meanings of the word. And President Obama is saying it's not a tax. He's saying it's not a tax in that your taxes are not going up because of this. It's just a different context of the sentence.
It just depends on what the meaning of the word is.
It's not a question of it's not a meaning of the is.
Come on, Bill.
Your tax, Matt Lewis's tax, has not gone up because of the bill. It has not, unless you're in. There's a separate surcharge on the wealthy that may be if you're in that income bracket. I didn't think you were, but as far as assuming that you have health insurance. And you're
but if I don't have health insurance, Bill, then will I be assessed a penalty or a tax?
You're being assessed a penalty by the IRS in the form of a tax.
Okay. So then Barack Obama was lying or wrong when he went on national television and said it wasn't a tax. So John Roberts in the Supreme Court was wrong.
He's still telling people you are going to pay money. He is telling people you are going to pay money if you don't get health insurance. Who cares at that point what kind of money that is? It's money. That's the important thing. It's
what
money.
What difference does it make at this point, said Hillary Clinton during the Benghazi hearing. It matters because this impacts the American public and the Supreme Court. This became the defining question that whether or not the ACA would be upheld. That's why it matters greatly.
It would be a lie. Deeply. It would be a lie if you were saying you don't have to pay money if you don't buy health insurance. That would be a lie. Everybody knew there is a cost to you if you don't buy health insurance. The agency that levies the penalty is really, frankly, irrelevant to the question.
But here's my question, though. Right? My question is: Gruber, an architect of Obamacare, and John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, say that Obamacare is a tax.
No, what he said was that under the taxing power of the Constitution, the federal government has a right to use the IRS to enforce this law.
President Obama went on TV and said it's not a tax. And President Obama went on. Now, if the American public had known it was a tax, they may have acted differently. They may have reacted differently to it.
If the American public was conned thinking their taxes would go up, yes, then the bill would have probably lost. But they knew that.
But I think this speaks to what Gruber said specifically, which is that we had to be intentionally opaque. That the voters are stupid. We couldn't tell them the truth about what this is. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. I could pull up the quotes.
That's a fairly extensive paraphrase there.
I could pull up the quotes, and frankly, they would be probably more damning than my paraphrasing of what he said. They're horrific.
But to your more pertinent point, what he said about the subsidies vis-a-vis state-run exchange versus federally run exchange, that is the live issue right now. That's what's before the Supreme Court, and the issue there is, generally speaking, the bill said the states would run their own health insurance exchanges or marketplaces, but if a state opted not to do that, then the federal government would run it for them. And there is a line in the law that talks about getting subsidies for when, if you're participating in a state exchange, and it doesn't spell out that it would apply for a federally run exchange in a state. I mean, there is no national exchange. They're all in states. The question is the state government running it or the federal government running it within that state. And the argument on the pro-Obamacare side is, and this was laid out very well in Linda Greenhouse's piece in the New York Times today, and also there was a SCOTUS blog post that E.J. Dionne of the Washington Post picked up that also talked about this. Under the Scalia School of Constitutional Interpretation, the textualist interpretation, they incorporate congressional intent when interpreting the text of legislation. You don't just look at an individual line. You look at the entirety of the law. You look at the debate surrounding the law within Congress before drawing the conclusion about a cherry-picked line. And you can look at the entire law and say, this law doesn't make sense if you interpret that one line in that way, because the other pieces of the law clearly are premised upon every state having the subsidies, which in fact Scalia and Alito and Kennedy and Thomas said themselves in their dissent in the earlier Obamacare ruling.
Right.
So
I'd make 2 points about that bill. Number one, when you have an architect of Obamacare before its passage saying that if states don't create their own exchange, their citizens won't be eligible for these tax credits, that implies to me that it's a feature, not a bug. That this is not something that was a typo. Secondly, I would bring up the fact that this is part and parcel of the problem of the way Obamacare was pushed through. That it passed with reconciliation on a party line vote, and so had there been buy-in, had Republicans and Democrats crafted something that might have gotten bipartisan support, I don't think you would have had these sort of legal challenges and problems. I think that there would have been time to get these things right and kind of work out the bugs. And I think this is, the chickens coming home to roost, so to speak.
Well, you get legal challenges for any big piece of reform that happens in every case. I mean, FDR had his New Deal stuff struck down outright in his first term. I think there's no way around that. This, as I think Jonathan Bernstein at Bloomberg View has talked about, this was not a rush job. This went along a time frame that was very, very normal for a big piece of legislation. But I think to Gruber's point, there was a lot of tortured language being used to try to avoid political pitfalls, and so that has led to a couple of snags here. But Gruber has already said that he misspoke when talking about the exchanges. Number two, there is no Supreme Court precedent about the intent of the outside architects and academic institutions of the legislation. There's a precedent about congressional intent, the people actually drafting the law. You cannot find any drafter of the law publicly saying this is what we meant, either after the law was passed or during when the law was passed. You can go to the congressional record. And that's what the courts usually do. They go to the congressional record. What were the legislators saying about the law at the time it was being debated? Not what some schmo said a year prior. You can't find a congressperson saying at the time this is
Bill, do you know why they didn't know that? No, do you know why they didn't know that? Because as Nancy Pelosi said, they had to pass the law to know what was in it. That's the reason. That's the reason. Look, you
have reams and reams of congressional record, people talking about the law at the committee level, on the House floor, on the Senate committee level, on the Senate House floor. If you can't find a single person interpreting the law the way you say, you don't have a congressional intent argument.
We have to pass this law to know what's in it. I mean, look, I guess fundamentally the question comes down to, are laws what they say, or are they what some people who voted on them think they said? And if that's our standard, then there may be a lot of things being overturned.
Well, we have courts to interpret laws. People often have differing interpretation of what laws mean. That's the state of the world forever. And we have certain schools of thought to try to interpret laws. One school of thought, and these things can work together. There's the textual interpretation, which in Scalia's words is holistic. It takes into account the entirety of the law, not a single line. You have the congressional intent school of thought. You look at what they were saying at the time, how they interpreted the law to mean as they were voting on it. Those are two pretty big ones. And the argument that this meant to deny subsidies to about 2/3 of the country participating in this program, which would make the program collapse. There's just no one saying that of anyone who actually is involved with wanting to pass the legislation.
Well, but I mean, I don't want to keep beating a dead horse, but clearly this would have been an incentive for states to create their own exchanges, which presumably is something that the Obama administration would have preferred based on, how the Obamacare rollout.
They most certainly would have preferred that. I mean, I think it's been a pretty big burden on them to have to run so many exchanges. That wasn't expected.
Right, and so that's why
deliberately obstructionist in doing so. And
right. But my point is that's the rationale for why this. Yeah, but that's the rationale for why the law was written this way. You want to strongly incentivize states creating their own exchanges.
You need to find someone making that argument who actually voted on it. Gruber doesn't have a vote. Gruber didn't write the law. You can say architect all you want. He did not write the law. He's some guy who had an idea about the law that people in Congress then wrote. They are the ones who have the votes. They're the ones whose thoughts get interpreted, not Gruber's.
All right. Why do I have the feeling that our debate is going to be more entertaining than the actual Supreme Court debate?
Oh, I don't know about that. That should be a very entertaining debate.
Well, these ours will be briefer. Here's one thing that I have learned, and is that I cannot predict what the Supreme Court is going to do. Even after we hear the oral arguments, you really can't. It's impossible, I think, to know. But I guess we could stop it there, Bill, on this contentious note.
And I feel that this midterm election is tearing us apart, Matt. The DMZ is in a dark place.
I think this was a good one. I think we had fun. And, every once in a while you got to spice it up, right? That's what keeps this marriage, What
will happen next week? It's a cliffhanger. Oh. Can they patch things up?
Until then, stay tuned. Check us out on Twitter at DMZ Show. And anything you need to plug this week, Bill? What should people read?
I got nothing.
All right. I want to plug my last two podcasts at the Matt Lewis and the News Show. You can find it on iTunes or at mattklewis.com. Two really cool interviews. I interviewed Eric Metaxas, who has a book out about miracles. He's the guy who wrote the book on Bonhoeffer and William Wilberforce. His new book is on miracles. Check that out. And then I interviewed Russ Roberts, who's from the Hoover Institution. He has a great podcast called Econ Talk. And he has a new book out about how Adam Smith can change your life. It focuses not on the wealth of nations, but on the other book written by Adam Smith, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is essentially arguing that we ought to be good people, moral people. And it is it's a side of Adam Smith that a lot of people who know his more, invisible hand economics, laissez-faire style don't fully appreciate. So check those out at my podcast.
All right. Well, until next week.
You got it.
We'll see you back here in the DMZ.
In the DMZ. Have a good one.